Hey everyone, this is the Reverend Kristen Yates with the Mission Cincinnati, and it's my delight to be able to host another Perspectives tonight. And whether you're joining us through Zoom or on Facebook Live, we're excited that you're here. And we're also just excited this night to have AudrieAna Gardner with us. AudrieAna is a member of the Mission, and she's also a licensed social worker. And tonight she's going to be speaking to us about something I think we're all interested in, and that is grief and anxiety in the pandemic. So what we'll do is what we usually do. We'll have about 20 to 30 minutes or perhaps more time of teaching from AudrieAna and discussion as she wants to lead it. And then we'll move into a time where we ask questions of AudrieAna, and I perhaps might ask some questions to you as well to just foster discussion. So welcome, AudrieAna. We are, again, very excited that you're here. And so without further ado, you can teach us what you'd like to teach us tonight. So thanks for being here.
Well, thank you. I hope that, with a small group here, we can have this be very discussion oriented. And I think what we all know is that the pandemic has definitely impacted us all in different ways. So, as human beings, we're wired to survive, and that's just how we're hardwired. And when our survival is threatened, we can find ourselves feeling everything from, unsettled to being in sheer panic. And so the pandemic has caused us to look inside ourselves and also outside of ourselves for some kind of a sense of security, a sense of purpose and hope. And some of us are doing better than others at this. But one thing's for sure, that we've forever been changed by it. And just like anything that's difficult that we go through in life, we have an opportunity to learn about ourselves and others and about God in the midst of our situation. And I think that those who can take this as an opportunity for growth can find there are a lot of lessons to be learned, right? But I think one of the things that's important to understand about any kind of stress or trauma that we go through in life is that we really need to understand who we were before we encountered this event that perhaps is life-changing. So as therapists, we're taught to, when we're working with trauma, big T trauma or little t trauma, as we call it, it's really important for us to know what they were like before the event happened, because it helps us understand the lens that they're looking at the event, and then helps us help them through that. And so I just wrote down some things that, and I think you guys have this handout, but I've also updated it as well. So some things that we like to look at as far as trying to understand how someone handles stress is we look at personality. So there are different personalities, right? There are optimists, there are pessimists. There are people who are very rigid and structured, and there are people who are very flexible and adaptable. That's part of our personality. There are fatalistic people, there are worriers, there are problem solvers and fixers. So kind of what was our personality like before this event happened? There's also like our own family of origin stuff. And what I mean by family of origin is the home that you grew up in 0 to 18 really impacts the formation of how you see the world and see yourself. So we look at that, and we help clients look at that. Also, people have had previous traumas, and some of us before this pandemic have had traumas, and some of those are healed and we're doing well with them, and some of them are not healed and they're unresolved. And so whenever you have another trauma layered upon other traumas, that's also something to take into consideration. There's also our culture. Like, our culture has a lot to do with how we handle stress. And within the culture of the United States, we have so many microcultures, so many cultures that we, even the Mission Cincinnati is a culture. So our culture has a lot to do with how we process stress and trauma. The other thing we have to take into consideration are the support systems that each of us have and the people around us. Some of us have great support systems with our family and friends and churches, and some of us don't. Some people are already isolated before this event happened, and now they're feeling even more isolated. So support systems. And then our spirituality, our faith, our trust in a higher power. Those of us who are have a strong faith, that's going to impact. And then those who don't have a faith or are questioning their faith, or maybe this trauma causes them to question their faith and spirituality. That's something else that we look at. Certainly, age and life experience will impact how people go through trauma. It's interesting how my generation looks at the pandemic and my parents' generation looks at the pandemic, and how my boys, the young adults, which some of you know them, how they are looking at the pandemic. Life experience does impact how we go through really challenging times. And then, of course, our financial stability. That's definitely, where were we before this trauma happened and how is it impacting us? One of the key things that is helpful for people going through stress and trauma is their ability to stay present. When we, if even before the pandemic, if you were one that raced ahead and worried about the future, boy, this is really going to rock you, right? If before the pandemic, you were one that kind of lamented about the past and you kind of had a lot of regret, that's kind of more the depressive kind of state. Then this is adding a layer. But if you're one that really can stay in the present, you tend to fare better when you're going through these things. So I just wanted to mention those things that all of us are coming into this pandemic, and we've endured the pandemic coming from a wide array of differences on all of these categories. So those listed out for you, we all have a different lens that we're approaching this pandemic through. And I think it's important to remember that there's no right way or wrong way necessarily. It's really just what your experience is. So I think that some of the characteristics that I would be asking you, or that we all can ask ourselves, of, am I generally a flexible or a rigid person, or somewhere in between? Do I generally run anxious or depressed, or somewhere in between? Am I a fairly steadfast person, or am I easily shaken? And there's no judgment in any of these. These are just things that you need to know about yourself. Am I fairly a contented person, or am I constantly looking to others and want what others have? Comparing myself to others. Before the pandemic, was I spiritually full, or was I in a desert place? Was I kind of deprived spiritually? Was I longing and I didn't really didn't feel strong in my faith? That's huge. Another one that's really big is, am I a trusting person, or am I a skeptical person? Just how I see things. Am I generally trusting or skeptical? That's going to really impact how you receive information during the pandemic. Am I a kind of person that accepts my current reality, or do I deny it or fight it? That's also something to ask yourself. And then, definitely for people who are physically healthy, that's one thing to go through a pandemic. For those that have they're immune compromised, they're going to have a very different experience of this. They're going to have some fears and worries that those of us who are physically well are not going to have. So that impacts you. And then finally, were you socially secure before the pandemic, or were you socially isolated? That's some kind of repetition from before. But these are all things that are good just to ask and know about yourself, because then it can inform you with self-understanding of how you're responding to things, and why sometimes people can get upset with one another because they're not responding to things differently. I think that's the thing that, if we as a community can really allow for a lot of different expressions of what's going on and accept people's realities, even though they might feel different than ours, that can go a long way in in feeling heard and understood. And I guess the final thing I'll kind of add to this portion is, I think as Christians, and certainly non-Christians, we do a lot of shoulds, and we like, I shouldn't feel angry, or I shouldn't be afraid, I should just trust God, right? These kinds of things. And I think we need to watch our language on that, because shoulds are really judgmental. So if I say to myself, I shouldn't be afraid, I'm denying the fact that I actually am afraid. I really am afraid. I'm just trying to tell myself not to be afraid. But really, God gave us all of the emotions for a reason, to inform us and to keep us safe. And so instead of saying I shouldn't be afraid, it really, what's healthier is I am afraid. And what do I need to do about that? What does my fear tell me about me? What does it tell me about what I need to do to protect myself? What does it tell me about God? What does it tell me about reaching out to others? So instead of fighting our emotions, like I shouldn't be angry, instead it's much healthier to say, I am angry. I don't know why, and I want to understand why. So that, I think, as we kind of assess ourselves, I always like to throw in emotion, because I think that's so important. So you'll have those in the handout that Kristen sent you, or these are kind of the things, the checkpoints that we're looking for. And I think before I go to the grief part, because that's not in the handout, because I just added the grief portion, I thought I would just stop and ask, does anyone have any questions about these things, about the idea that how we move through trauma has a lot to do with who we were before we encountered the trauma. And so understanding ourselves during a pandemic, it's really helpful to know kind of who we were, or what our, where we were on all of these things prior to, going through it. And then knowing that our character can be shaped as we go through this difficulty. And so some of those things, maybe we were a rigid person, and maybe one of the, maybe we were really rigid and had trouble being flexible and adaptable. And maybe one of the blessings that can come out of something like this is that we start to hold things more loosely. We start to learn how to be flexible, because it just causes us so much suffering to not be flexible and adaptable. Maybe that's just one example of how a traumatic or a stressor can actually help change us in a positive way. Unfortunately, it can also change us in a negative way. And I certainly see that with my clients. I see both with my clients. But I think I'll just stop right there, because that was a lot that I ran through of kind of the different things that we look at as to kind of what makes up a person as they're going through something. Does anyone have any comments, even if you don't have questions?
Yeah, sure. I'll just say I really appreciate what you're saying in terms of the self-reflection and the no judgment, because I do think it's often that I'm fearful, I'm afraid. And I found in the church often it's like, well, you shouldn't be afraid, trust in God. And a lot of times when I am feeling fearful about something, it's not because I don't trust God. It's just that I am what I am. And so, as you said, to be able to like dig deeper and figure that out is more helpful than just getting a talk, just trusting God. And so I think with anything, and including this pandemic, I really love that is the place for us to start, is how are we feeling, why, and to also just recognize that, yeah, how we've been formed up until this point does affect how we respond. And so we are going to respond differently, and there's nothing wrong with that. So anyway, I just want to say I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I've got a question, and I just stole a squeaky toy from my dog, so hopefully I can keep him quiet while I ask. I really appreciate the again, the self-awareness piece, as Kristen was saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking about the ways, he really wants a squeaky toy, that we, the things that even I've seen in myself going through this pandemic, and you've used the example of being rigid versus flexible. And there are many cases where I've seen like, oh, I thought I was a really flexible person, but it actually turns out like I want a lot more control than I thought I did. Do you have any words of wisdom or things that you've seen be helpful when we discover those things about ourselves? Like, I'm more rigid than I thought I was. What can we do with that? Or is there anything we can do with that that helps us? That helps us move in a more positive direction rather than a negative direction, and allowing the trauma of this pandemic in particular to how can we make that move us in a positive direction rather than a negative direction?
I think that's a really, really good question. Part of having a more rigid personality, there's the rigid personality part, but then there's also kind of, this is where family of origin stuff comes in, is how we were parented. And so if we had parents who were kind of controlling, or maybe they weren't controlling. And so one of our adaptive strategies is to try to control the things around us so that we feel secure. And so moving to center in that, right? We don't want things to be out of control, but we also don't want to be so controlling of things that we're just so rigid and inflexible. That causes a lot of suffering in our lives because we can't adapt, and we're just constantly. So I think it's being able to accept our humanity and seeing it kind of as a humanity piece. Like, why am I trying to be God? We all are trying to do that at some level. We all really are. It sounds like, no, I'm not trying to be God. No, when you're trying to control things, which I do, or other people, trying to control other people. It's like we're trying to not accept our humanity and our fragility. And when you can really embrace the fact that I'm fully human and I don't have to get it right all the time. I can learn from my mistakes. I'm supposed to learn and grow. I'm not supposed to get it right out of the blocks every time. It's this idea of really embracing my humanity, and that there is some fragility in my humanity. There's crisis comes up, and we want it all to work out, but there is this, the pandemic has definitely reminded people that we are not in control, and that can be really hard for us. Like I said, all different expressions of that. It can be hard and really frustrating. So I guess my words of encouragement would be, when you find yourself bumping up against that in your life and you feel this rigidity and this like, like this is not going the way I wanted it to go. Just, to take a breath and to say, I am fully human, and it's okay if everything is not going exactly the way I want it to go. It's okay if I don't have the script for this. It's okay if I bounce around and bumble around and knock my head on the wall, and I don't, that's just who I am. That's who we are. I don't know if that's the short answer.
Yeah, that's totally helpful. And I think in my mind, at least, it's connected with, what Kristen was saying, that sometimes the simple answer is like, well, just trust God, don't be afraid, or God is in control, so you don't have to be. But thinking paired with that, with who God is, being reminded of who we are and our humanity and our limitedness and our fragility, beside God's humanity and God's divinity and his control and his, God's humanity in Jesus. But yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Good. I speaking of anxiety, when my kids were small, I read them this book, Hind's Feet on High Places. It's an old classic. I don't know if you've heard of it. But it's a parable, like it's like the Chronicles of Narnia or something, like that, where it's this little deer, and her name is Much Afraid, and she's much afraid, obviously, and it just journeys through her life. And every time she bumps up against that rigidity and that fear of not being able to move forward, or not trusting God, because God is the shepherd, he's kind of walking alongside her, and she kind of moves through that. She creates like a little stones of remembrance, like a little altar kind of thing, so that when she's coming back down the mountain, she can remember, that's where God reminded me that I'm his and he's going to take care of me. That's where God reminded me that I don't have to have all the answers to be able to keep moving forward, right? But she was always, anytime she encountered something new, she was much afraid. And so I just think that sometimes there have been a couple of times in my life where God has worked on me. And I have gone and purchased like a little memorial or something that reminds me that I learned this lesson, and I want to come back to this and remember this. One's a piece of jewelry that I just he walked with me, and I wanted to memorialize that. So sometimes if you kind of have themes in your life where he's working on you about being rigid or fatalistic or whatever it might be, and you learn that, maybe to have something that you can go back and remember that I trusted him in this place and he showed up, and I'm going to keep remembering that. So I don't know why I mentioned that. I just remembered that from the story. Okay. I think this next section is probably my more favorite one, and this is what's not in your handout, but I did send it to Kristen, and she's going to send it to you. You guys may have seen the article that was floating around Facebook, and it was called "That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." I don't know if that's familiar to any of you, but it was an interview with the guy's last name is Kessler, and he worked with Kubler-Ross, who developed the stages of grief, and he actually was able to add one last stage to it. So I included in this because I think what that article was helpful with me and my clients and my staff. I sent it to my staff, and then we were able to then pass that idea along to clients, is that sometimes we don't identify grief as grief. Sometimes when we feel grief, we instead feel anger first. So there's primary and secondary emotions. Sometimes we might feel anger first, or someone might feel guilt first, or they might feel fear, right? These are kind of primal feelings. They might feel those, but when they really get to the bottom of it, it's grief. It's just grief. And this article came out like a few weeks after the pandemic, and I thought that it really did a good job of explaining that we all have had a lot of losses through this period of time. And I find clients initially, they were very angry. And it took a while to work through that anger. And particularly when you add the social and racial injustice and upheaval, and then this election. So you got this three things that are in and of themselves, any one of them would be horrible to have to deal with. And so people have this initial gut reaction feeling. And when they finally work through that, below it is this deep, deep, deep sadness and grief. And if we can get down to that, you can do some work around that, you're with journaling and talking to people and prayer. But I think we do need to see, work with the anger, work with the fear, work with the primary emotion, but then realize underneath that, there's probably some grief in there. So I added that in here. We have lost a sense of normalcy. That's something we can grieve. There is no normal right now. It's changing, right? We are experiencing something that Kessler called collective grief. And that's when, you know, when we lose a loved one, it's like everyone who knew that person is the one who experiences the grief. But here, the world, like, we are collectively grieving a lot of the same things as a whole world. And I think he was talking about, that's a very unusual thing for all of us to be grieving at the same time. And so that's, and we're all kind of grieving differently. The other thing he talked about was we're experiencing anticipatory grief. And that is the grief of, like, we're anticipating, like, people are going to continue to die from this virus. So is that going to be me? Is it going to be grandpa? Is it going to be my neighbor? There's this anticipation of, if I don't do the things right, or if this doesn't get under control, more people are going to die. And it even could be someone I know. And so that's kind of this anticipatory grief. So it hasn't happened yet, but we think it will. And at its worst, anticipatory grief is anxiety, because anxiety really is about not being able to control the future. Anxiety is about living in the future, not being present. So whenever I'm worried about the future, I'm trying to control something that I have no control over. And so the antidote to that is to stay very present and say, well, what do I do know about today? And what do I do know about me right now in this space? But this anticipatory grief, he said, this is what leads to anxiety. The other thing he talked about, what we grieve, is we've lost our sense of safety. And we collectively have lost our sense of safety, both at the micro level and at the macro level. So whether you're, single and living alone, the micro level, we've lost the sense of safety, and we're grieving that. And then at the macro level, like, not being able to fly across the country and not being able to do this, not being able to do that, the systems, the government. I mean, the president has corona now. I mean, it's like, it's this macro level of grief. And then I'll just highlight those stages of grief, because we don't go through them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They kind of ebb and flow, and they pop in and out of our lives. And so I wanted to give you guys the stages of grief that Kubler-Ross came up with when people are either terminally ill and they're going through the stages, or when someone has lost a loved one and then they go through these stages. It's important for you to identify them and know that it's grief. So the first one is denial. Like, oh, this virus, it's not a big deal. It's, we deal with flu. It's going to be fine. So just denial is one stage. Another stage is anger. And that's just that constant anger and frustration, these stupid masks, and and people are raging on Facebook, and, that's the anger. The third stage of grief is bargaining. Like, if I do this, then I'll get that. If I just work harder, if I just clean more, if I just live a good life, if I just pray more, then I won't have to, feel this sadness. And then the fourth stage is sadness. And that's just being blue and being sad. And that's totally okay. And that might last for a while too. And then Kubler-Ross said the last stage, the final stage for her, was acceptance. That finally, when people who are terminally ill or who have lost a loved one, or maybe us in the pandemic, are finally like, okay, I accept that this is my reality. I accept it, and I'm going to work with it, and I'm going to do what I can to get through it in the best way I can. But I'm not fighting it anymore. I'm not angry anymore. I'm not denying it. I'm not bargaining it. I'm just like, this is my reality, and I'm going to get through it the best way I can. But Kessler thought that there needed to be a sixth stage of grief. And he worked really closely with Kubler-Ross and the family after she passed away. It allowed him to add a sixth stage. And he calls it meaning. And I think I really like that, because when we can draw meaning out of our loss and grief, it gives it a purpose. And there's value. So I think that many of us, and particularly, if you're a leader or business owner, you're just like, when the pandemic hit, you're just like, I just got to keep moving. I got to keep figuring this thing out. I got to support the people around me. I got to keep, and we didn't stop and actually go, what's going on with me? You know? So that's why I wanted to include those, because if you see those popping up in your life, instead of pushing them down and saying, oh, I shouldn't be, you know, in sadness, or I shouldn't be in anger. I shouldn't be bargaining. Like, God, if I pray more and fast more, will you do, you know, instead of that, just say, you know what? Whoa, this is one of those stages of grief. I just need to let that come. I just need to work with that stage, however I need to talk with a friend. And I have some recommendations that I can give you, but instead of pushing that away, just accept it and move through it. There's a quote from a guy named Ian Crone. He's a psychotherapist. He also is a liturgical pastor, and he also now is like an authority on the Enneagram. And he wrote The Road Back to You with Suzanne Stabile. I don't know if any of you guys are Enneagram people, but he has a podcast called Typology, and I had to stop in the middle of my workout so I could write down this quote, because I was like, this is so good. And I'm just going to read it to you, but it is on the second handout that you'll get. He says, grief is a very complicated emotion. I would argue that grief is the most difficult emotion to work with because it is such a helpless feeling. It's like, what do I do with it? But no, actually, it's like, what is it doing to you? The question is, will you allow grief to have its way with you? And then when it's done doing its work on you, it will pass on its own. Do not cut corners with grief, or you will elongate the process. Let it have its way with you. I loved that quote because I have clients come in who have pushed down grief for years without knowing it. And then there's an anniversary date, or there's a new relationship, or there's something, and there's some trigger that opens up this, been carrying, 10 years of grief. And we all do this. I do this. That they didn't realize that they had not grieved something. And then we can finally work. But I love that quote, like, let grief have its way with you, because if you keep fighting it and pushing away, then it will elongate the process, and you might be paying for that for a lot of years to come. And so I don't know what that means for this pandemic, like all of the grief that the whole world has experienced. I don't know what that means, but I think that our God grieves. I think our God grieves with us. We know that. And so it's an acceptable emotion. It is a holy emotion. And if we don't embrace it and if we just put a happy face on and we just no, you shouldn't be afraid, Kristen. No, you shouldn't be angry. No, you shouldn't be. If we don't really embrace it and work with it, we're really missing an opportunity to grow through it and to let it do its work in us and change us and grow us. Some of the recommendations that I'll give recommendations, and then we can chat, is that is allow yourself to move through any of those stages of grief. When you see them, just identify them and allow them and work through them. The other one is, this one may pertain to what you said, Emily, is practice letting go of what you can't control. So this is back to that issue of control, is that, it is a practice, like a spiritual practice, to remind myself, oh, whoa, okay, well, I'm not God. And I cannot control what just happened there, or this and that. So what can I control and let go, really let go? But many of us sometimes just get so frustrated, right? With, I just can't. I think it's really important to talk to family and friends about what you're thinking and feeling. And to Kristen's point, when we have friends talking to us about how they're thinking and feeling, we really need to listen and validate their feelings, rather than tell them they should or shouldn't and just have faith. right? So to be able to really validate those, even though they make no sense to us. Like you could have someone who is like, I have clients who have tons of money. They're like tons of money, and they are fretting and worrying about their financial stability. And, my old brain, I'm more empathetic now because of the work I do, but my old brain would have been like, do you realize like there's people out there that are paycheck to paycheck and they should be worrying about money, right? But here I've got this like, top exec, and he's like freaking out. And so I'm like, oh, that's really your security. So that is scary. That makes a lot of sense. See, just validating it rather than judging the emotion, I validate that and go, what's that about, right? So I think that's really important as listeners in the body of Christ. If we can just validate people's experience and emotions rather than trying to make them different. And then journaling is really important. And because I was just reading on 20 minutes a day can improve your outlook and your mood. And we also know if people can practice gratitude by naming 3 things they're grateful for each day. And these are like scientific studies that after, I can't remember how many, 30 days or whatever it is, the control group that didn't do the gratitude or the journaling stayed the same. And the ones that did the gratitude journaling had an increase in a better mood, less depressed, less anxiety. So I've journaled in and out like in my life so much, and I go on stints of like 2 months and then I'll go 2 months off. And so I just started again because I was like, this is really important. I need to be doing this. So I think that's something that we can all do. And this is 20 minutes a day. I found that even 5 minutes a day, particularly if you're just doing a gratitude practice, and it may seem strange that I'm talking about grief and gratitude at the same time. So here's what's interesting is that we had staff meeting this Tuesday, and I told my team, I said, I'm talking about grief and anxiety to my church. And I just wonder, and I mentioned some things I wanted to mention. I said, but is there anything that you all would say after working with all your clients, and it's teens all the way up to, older people. And they said, if people can learn to hold gratitude and grief at the same time, that it goes a long way. But a lot of times we want to say, but instead of and. We want to say, I'm angry, but I'm grateful, or I'm sad, but I'm this, but it's like, no, you can have grief and gratitude. You can grieve the state of our country, in regards to race and justice. You can have a lot of grief, and you can have gratitude for the freedoms that we have compared to other countries. You can hold both. It's okay. One does not exclude the other. So I think that was an interesting comment from one of the therapists. And the other therapist who actually just did, he was like, oh, this is perfect. I just did this for Crossroads. So all the staff of Crossroads, they put them through a mental health kind of grief education. And one of my staff did that for them. And he said that he came up with something that they all really, really liked. And I thought I'd pass it on to you. He said, write out a lament to God. Just write a letter of lament. And I really like that, because there's grief, but lament is also like, it's not complaining in a sense. It's like, it's lamenting. And I think Kristen, theologically, you can explain to us, maybe give us a little word on lament here in a minute. But when I think about the Psalms, and I think about Job, and I think about Lamentations, I mean, there's a lament for the losses that we've had, for the losses, personally, family, neighborhood, church. I have 2 boys still looking for a job. There's no job, like opportunity, right? Dreams, lament that it's not happening the way we want it to happen. And he said, just to write out a lament to God, pour out your grief, pour out your losses. He can handle it. And I thought and he said, just get it out. Don't carry it. It's toxic. Just get it out. And I thought, that's also really good. But see, what I forget sometimes to spend time in those more difficult emotions, but they're there, whether I know it or not, they're there. So to give yourself a little room, a morning or a day, or, that you practice that, it may just lift a lot of heaviness. So maybe, Kristen, could you give us just a little quick, maybe definition of lament? I hate to put you on the spot, and then
I just preached on it a couple of weeks ago. And actually, what I will do is I will direct anybody who's listening on Facebook Live or in Zoom to my website, rhythmsoftheway.org, which I'll include, and go to practices, and there's a section on lament, and it's going to help you write lament. And what's actually so great about what you just said, AudrieAna, there's two bits of feedback. The first one was grief and gratitude together, and then the second one was lament. Well, actually, all those things go together, because that is what the practice of biblical lament does. You start out sharing all your emotions, all the nitty-gritty, but there's this thing that happens, that grief can give way to praise. It's not necessarily like, yay, we're so happy, Lord, but there's this sense that praise and worship comes out of our experience of sharing our sadness, our anger, our just woes with the Lord, bringing them to Him. So yeah, it's not just complaint. It's taking everything we're feeling and being honest with the Lord, speaking to Him about these things in prayer, and then miraculously, in His own way, He transforms them. It may take time, but there's a transformation that comes, and there's an intimacy that comes with the Lord through that. So all to say, I was not taught anything about the practice of biblical lament through the life of being a Christian for all these years. And so it's kind of a new practice for me, and I'm absolutely convinced that this is something we should be doing all the time, both individually. So as you said, AudrieAna, write it out. And what I'll share on my website gives you actually simple instructions of how to do that. But then we also need to do this corporately as a church. And I think we need to do it regularly. We wait for big things to happen and be like, oh, let's get together to lament. And I've decided that actually we should have regular rhythms in our church where we do this, because there's always things that we're all dealing with, either individually or corporately, that we need to bring to the Lord. Because if we don't bring them to the Lord, they eat us up. I guess the sermon I preached a couple of weeks ago, it was the one where the psalmist talks about dashing the children's heads to the rocks, and you're like, what in the world? That's not something you say. But that person was hoping for justice, because that had been what the Israelites' experience was. And well, what about forgiveness? Well, yes, Jesus is all about forgiveness, but it's only as we name even those darkest desires that God can do something with them. So as we name these needs for revenge, God takes them, and then we no longer need to seek out our revenge. We can trust God to bring the justice. And then God heals our heart, and in His own time He brings forgiveness. It's not necessarily automatic. It can take a really long time, but name even our darkest emotions, those unchristian things, and God will meet you in that. Whereas if you stuff it down, it's going to control you. Even if you don't know it's controlling you, it's going to do it subconsciously. So anyway, I talk too much, but sorry, AudrieAna, I am actually pretty passionate about this lament idea these days.
Hey, I'm so glad. Thank you. That I really am thankful that you had that, because I do think that that's one of the reasons therapy works. People come in and they are able to get out all of the stuff that they're trying to protect others from or protect themselves from, and they name it, and they say it and it becomes a reality, and they talk about it with someone else, and someone else sees their shame or their anger or whatever it is and validates it. And I'm telling you, it's so to do it with God. And I need to make this more practice too, because I can just keep going, right? And it's like to sort of be disciplined and make that a spiritual practice. So thank you. So I guess I want to just open it up, like either for a question, or maybe you want to have a reflection of, what have you learned about yourself through the pandemic? What have you learned about your faith, or maybe your personality, or maybe how you function relationally? Like those are questions that I would leave with you. And if you're brave enough to answer them, you can, or if you have another question for me, we can use the final time for that.
I just have a thought to share first, something that was really helpful that you mentioned. Just kind of putting together the ideas of collective grief, and then the stages of grief, and thinking about how, yes, in our own individual experiences, we kind of, ebb and flow in and out of those different stages, and we don't go through it in a linear fashion. I'm just thinking about how in collective grief, we're all going through those stages of grief at different times, at different paces. And I'm just reflecting on my own experience through this pandemic, and moments when I've been really frustrated with other people, or really confused by other people's reactions or lack thereof, where I think they should be reacting more strongly. And just reframing that in terms of, possibly us being in different places in those stages of grief, and responding really, really differently to the same circumstances, just helps me even retroactively have more compassion for other people. I'm not sure how helpful retroactive compassion is, but that's a helpful way for me to just approach other people with more grace, continuing to move forward through this. Particularly in cases where I get really frustrated with somebody else's denial. I'm like, don't you see what's happening? And maybe they really do. And that's exactly why they're in that, in that space. So thank you for that. That's really helpful.
Thanks. I think that just the way you said that was so well said, that if we are going through this collective grief, and there are all these 6 stages, we're obviously not all going through the same one at the same time. So what we're seeing in someone else is just another stage. And so that gives, helps us to have compassion, and we all don't have to be at the same place at the same time. Actually, grief, I did take a special class in grief in grad school. And one of the things that was sad to me, but is a reality, is that when couples lose a child, like my in-laws have, they lost a child when he was 16. He was in an accident, and he didn't die until he was 20, I think, something. And they're together, and that's wonderful. But it's very, very common when a couple experiences an intense grief and loss like that their marriage doesn't make it. And so most of us know that. But in this class in grief, we kind of broke that down from a psychological perspective. And one of the main reasons is that the parents were grieving differently, and they were furious with one another for not being at the same stage or dealing with it in the same way. So, this is where we look at men deal with grief differently as a whole, and women deal with grief differently. And so if it's a husband and wife, they're going to deal with it as genders differently, and they're going to be in different stages. And so the disruption was not because you remind me of our lost child and I'm getting divorced. The disruption was like, you're not grieving enough, or you're grieving too much. And that's why they could never accept one another's stage and experience. So just to your point, Emily, that boy, in the church, we need to give a lot of grace to one another for all just how we're dealing with this. And yeah, denial is a hard one to deal with and they usually are out of touch with the grief. It's not until retroactively that they realize, oh, I was in denial and that really was grief. Anybody else have any comment or question or?
Yeah, and I'll be honest, when you said to hold the grief and hold the gratitude, with the not the but the and, man, I was like, man, it's hard in seasons like this to be like, I'm really discouraged about how the system is dealing with justice, and I'm grateful, and at the same time that it's like I'm discouraged, and I'm trying to figure out how to be grateful. Like I'm still good, I'm not thinking that in the moment. I'm thinking like, man, people are tripping and they need to get it together. So, but that's why I'm still going is have because I'm always looking at the but, this is happening, but what we're moving towards, this is happening, but what you gonna do about it, kind of thing, rather than saying, okay, this is happening, and at the same time, I'm grateful that this is happening. And so I think hearing it like that before, for me, I'm always looking at this is happening, but staying in the looking forward towards the goal rather than being present and being grateful for the everyday things. But it's hard, and it's when a lot of the everyday things seem to just be conflicting with each other. And so I appreciate that, because that's something I don't think about often. I'm always, because I think it's the culture. I think it's how I grew up. It's like you see people use terminology and say, it's like, man, I hate this, but it ain't gonna be too long. They'll say like, man, I hate this, and I'm doing this. So it's when you're around I'm around a lot of the terminologies they use, but to either justify why I'm still in, why I'm still in, like I'm angry, so I may stay that way until stuff change, but or why I'm not healing this but it's never an and. So I think those, depend on how people you're around and how you kind of perceive that. You just hear that a lot, so you kind of adopt it as well, especially in times like this. So
well, one of the things I want to make sure is clear. Thank you, Charles. I really appreciate that perspective, because I want to make sure that you all heard what I was intending to say.
Yeah.
So it's that I can grieve like the social
injustice. Right.
And I can also have gratitude or be grateful, not for the social injustice.
Right.
But for something else in my life. So grieve the social injustice, the racial injustice, and maybe be grateful that I can vote, and be grateful that I can protest, and be grateful that I can rally, to be able to find and be grateful that God sees it and weeps with me.
Right.
That's kind of what I meant by that. But that word, and, I'm telling you, that has changed clients' lives. There was one guy I was working with, and he was really working on something, and he just was like, man, it's really good that I'm pursuing this, but it's really hard. And I could just feel the weight on him. And I said to him, wait a minute, it's good and it's hard. And he just started weeping. He was like, when you say it that way, I can embrace both that it's good and it's hard. When I say it's good, but it's hard, I'm still fighting it in my spirit. So I guess that's to your point, Charles.
Yeah. I think to look at grief as not always look at it as negative, but that it's also a process that helps move you towards something moving you through the process of healing and things like that. So I think with that, flipping it on his head and saying, okay, all this is just not going to wallow in just the negative all the time with it, just to say, I'm here and I'm here, but to truly, how do I move forward and process? So I think what you just said, really, that's encouraging, because like, oh, I got to say, this is hard, but yeah, I'm still working at it,
Right.
But I think sometimes it's easy to say, this is hard, and you kind of lose hope and like, and I'm still working, because you feel like, am I working isn't moving anywhere when you can't see the tangible results. And I think that's why having to understand like, oh, this is good, and I know the Lord is still sitting in this with me. There's still hope on the other end of this. And so if I can move forward with that tunnel vision, with that, it makes the and a lot more sweeter rather than it being so negative. Because the but sometimes seem more sweeter, like, oh, but this, because it's an easy kind of mask to put on to not deal with the, just seeing what's happening so close. So that's good. Yeah. That's all. Yeah.
The word but, it changes the first word. So if it's good, if it's hard, but it's good, it excludes the first word. If you and it, then you can hold them both together. And I think, just to wrap it up, I think, Charles, to your point, that's where lament comes in. That's where I think I want to really explore that practice. So thank you for sharing that, your website. So I'll have to look at that lament practice.
Yeah, and so in the Facebook Live feed, I will include that link to my website. I also include AudrieAna's present worksheet that you can look at tonight. And then as soon as I get a chance, I will update it with her new one, which includes the grief part. And you can always find that on our Mission Cincinnati /perspectives page. You'll be able to find the video recording of this in a couple days, and you'll be able to find the notes. So definitely do check those things out. And I encourage you, she asked questions in her handout, such as, what has your experience been in this pandemic? Are you feeling grief? Are you feeling anxiety? What have you learned about yourself in this? And so I do encourage you all to take some time for self-reflection, so that this is a time of growth for you. I mean, Jesus weeps with us in this. This is not fun. This is not good. But there is an opportunity for growth. So take some time to reflect on those. So we are at the end of our time. So AudrieAna, thank you so much again for being here with us tonight. And for all of you joining us on Zoom or on Facebook Live, if you have other questions or thoughts, please email us or just respond in the Facebook Live feed. And I also want to invite you to our next perspective. So next week, Dr. Tricia Eschliman-Latimer is going to be speaking on the Christian perspective of depression. So that should also be a really good and relevant talk for all of us in this time of the pandemic and just in general. So I welcome you to come back next week, same time, Thursday night, 7:30 to 8:30. So thanks, AudrieAna, and thanks again, friends, for being with us, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.